Hey there, Wargamers. Austin here with Brush for Hire and Death Ray Designs, and I'm joined as usual by
Chris the Initiate.
And today we're going to talk to you about something that you may not consider to be particularly important to your wargaming and modeling experience, but it is in fact very crucial to getting a good-looking model in the end. This episode is going to be about assembly, and we're going to introduce you, perhaps, to a few new tools and some things to get started down the road to good assembly jobs that will yield the best possible canvas for your paint job. There are a few tools that I think are particularly good to start out with when you're building up your hobby arsenal. And I think that Chris has been on the right path there, and so I'm going to let him talk about some of the things that he's bought recently, just getting started doing your own assembly.
So the most important tools that I found are flush cutters, a really good blade, and a pin vise, which really doesn't sometimes seem like all that necessary, but can be really helpful in certain situations.
Definitely. Now, one thing to note about flush cutters, which are also sometimes called snippers or sprue cutters, they are a very specific tool and are not the same as wire cutters or tin snips or scissors or even an X-Acto knife. Now, you can get the job done with an X-Acto knife, and I know that you did for a little while, but it's a pain, and you'd be better served just cutting with a sprue cutter. Now, the thing that makes a sprue cutter or a pair of flush cutters different from a normal pair of clippers is that the two cutting surfaces that come together to cut your piece away from the frame actually come together in a flat instead of having like a rounded underside that has kind of a V-shaped cutter in between. These actually come down to a flat surface so that when you're trimming things away from a sprue, you get a nice clean flat edge against your part, which means minimal cleaning afterwards. You're not having to gouge out or really whittle away a whole bunch of material still left over from the frame. Where did you manage to pick yours up from?
I actually got mine from Home Depot in a pack of 2 that actually came with a pair of pliers as well for about $9. But I know you can get them from places, hobby stores or
Amazon,
different hardware stores. So
yeah.
They're fairly cheap, and it's something that, like Austin said, will save you so much time that it's really worth the cost.
Chances are you're not going to spend any more than $10 to $15 on them, and they will last a very long time as long as you're not cutting anything really abrasive. The next thing that you said was a blade. So when we're talking about a blade or a knife, we're talking about a razor. So these are X-Acto knives, things very much like them, all the off-brand non-X-Acto blades, which are essentially just the cylinder of metal with a triangular razor blade at the end. Those are pretty standard across the board. There's also other kinds of razors that you use, and I've got a particular kind that I like, and I'm pretty passionate about it, and that is the snap blade utility knife. Now, when I'm talking about the snap blade utility knife, this is not the dollar store 2 pieces of plastic that clip together and have a chintzy little razor in the middle. It's not the clicky kind that you probably have a dozen of in some junk drawer in your house. This is a really sturdy, hard plastic with a metal inlaid trough for the blade to ride in. And instead of using a clicking mechanism to push it forward, it uses a little set screw with a little wheel that makes it easy for you to tighten it. I find that having something that is not perfectly cylindrical, it allows me to grip it a little bit better and keep it so that the blade is exactly parallel or perpendicular to what it is that I'm cutting on. So that I don't accidentally have it start to loosen up and then the blade falls flat or goes in unexpected directions, because the last thing you need when you're cutting something with a razor is unexpected movement.
I think right now you can actually find the specific brand that Austin likes on Amazon for about $10. So
it is the Olfa, O-L-F-A. I'll put a link in the description, or at least a picture on the screen probably somewhere of this blade. It's a bright yellow knife with a silver trough running down it. And they're really nice. They last a long time. I've got a handful of them just because I like having one at each of my workstations. So now, this last tool that you mentioned that you thought may not seem as critical is a pin vise. And that is essentially like a little tiny drill bit holder. It looks kind of like, or can look kind of like an X-Acto knife, where you've got a little chuck at the end, you put the bit or blade into and you tighten it down. But instead of being just two flat pieces that squeeze a blade, it has several little chuck pieces that pinch a drill bit. Now, this is not the types of drill bits that you're probably going to find at a hardware store. These are much, much smaller. And do you want to talk about what all you've been doing with yours?
Yeah, actually, I had a problem where a model lost its staff for Wrath of Kings, the Rathor staff, and was kind of worried that we weren't going to be able to do anything with it, and it was just going to kind of look, the aesthetic of the model was going to be off. And so when I asked Austin about it, we decided that we would use the pin vise, drill out the hand, and actually just put a brass rod through it, attach the head of the staff back to it, and now it still looks great. So it saved us in that instance. But I know other people have used them for things like pinning models to bases, pinning pieces together that are hard and don't have a good surface to be able to just glue.
It's a very versatile tool when it comes to model making. And like Chris said, pinning, and I'll explain that for those of you who may not be familiar yet, is essentially putting a hole into two separate pieces that are supposed to sit flush together, that are very small, or you need them to be extra stable, and glue on these two surfaces isn't going to hold those pieces together. You may find this when you're working with pewter models or pieces of models that are very, very thin. If it's thick enough that you can put a drill bit through it, you can add a piece of pinning material like a little brass rod into both sides, and when you glue it together, it gives you some extra sturdiness in that join. Next, we should talk about supplies. Now, this is going to be different from tools in that these are consumables. These are the things that you're going to use up and be out of, like glue or putty and things like that. So, what kind of situations have you gotten yourself into with these types of items, with your consumables, that you've learned something from that would be good to share?
Well, I think glue is really important. We use a super glue in our group that's called Zap-A-Gap, and it's really great, and it sets pretty quick. That comes with its own challenges. I have glued many a finger to a model to only find that when I thought the pieces were glued together, I now had it attached to my finger instead of the rest of the model. Right. I've also left skin on models, so you got to be careful with those, but using the right amount will really make for a sturdy application. And when you're assembling, you really want that to hold well. As far as putty goes, green stuff, it's magic. It's kind of the industry standard. Don't be fooled like I was when you first see it. It's actually blue and yellow, which comes together to make green, which is kind of, my first thought was that's not green at all. But anyway, it's a great thing. You can use to sculpt and kind of make different model alterations and things that kind of make you set apart and unique, while also filling in gaps or doing some other things that just kind of refine your model a lot.
Yeah. So essentially, we've talked about Zap-A-Gap now. And green stuff putty, but there are other versions of both of those things that you should be aware of. And we would encourage you to test them out before you start using them on your expensive models. The entire point of this section is to be familiar with your supplies. So with glue, definitely less is more most of the time. In fact, I've got some hilarious stories about overgluing models and then essentially having to chip them back apart with a chisel to reclaim certain parts. One of the guys in our group did that. You know who you are. So now you've talked about green stuff and super glue, but one of the things that you should also be aware of is that there are many different types of putties and glues out there that if you want to be adventurous, you can go check them out. You should definitely be familiar with them before you start using them on your expensive models though. Along with super glue, we also have plastic glue or plastic weld, and that essentially chemically bonds two pieces of plastic together to make them like one piece of plastic. A very, very strong bond. But you have to be careful with it because it melts plastic. You get a little bit of extra glue on top of a head and it drips down. Well, now you've made a Two-Face model. Congratulations. There's a variety of other types of glue that you may come in contact with, but those are the main two. Less is more, generally. Be careful how much you're putting down. The other thing, putty, there are more than just green stuff. You also have things like milliput and other types of two-part epoxy putties. Milliput is interesting and different from green stuff in that it is less plastic and stretchable, and it's more like clay. You can use water to smooth it out. Adding water onto the top of it while it's still setting ends up giving that type of clay slip feel, so you can get it really polished and smooth before it even sets. So our last piece of advice for you is going to be really simple, and it's going to be really hard for you to hear, but I need you to hear it. It is take your time. I know that you're excited and you're ready to get those models onto the table, but trust me, you're going to be really upset with yourself if you don't take the time to clean and assemble your models properly before you start painting them. These games are really exciting and the models look amazing, but they're not going to look amazing if you leave lots of gaps and mold lines and sprue areas still stuck onto your models. In your experience so far, just getting started, what have you found that you really need to take your time on?
I think for me, it's probably mold lines mostly. I think my biggest problem was I got excited about two particular models that I wanted to put on the board, and I wanted to get painted up, and everything was great. And then I primed them, and everything was moving along, and got them all painted up, and probably spent 6 to 8 hours on each model, being as big as they were. And come to find out, there's still mold lines on them, and now I'm stuck at a place of, well, do I go back? Do I try to fix it and mess everything up potentially, or do I just live with it and know that that was my first model?
Mold lines are kind of a tricky thing. You won't see them as well as you think you should until you've already got not just primer but paint down on it. And then you'll really start to see them. You're really getting in and looking at that model, and you're like, oh man, there's a huge mold line. I thought it was a vein, and nope, it's a mold line. Even if nobody else notices it, it's your model and you notice it. So now, one thing that you should probably understand is why mold lines exist in the first place. If you're unaware of how your models are made, they're made with at least 2-part molds most of the time, which means that you have 2 plates of usually some sort of rubber or silicone or metal that come together to make a cavity that's the shape of your model or model parts. And they inject plastic or resin or metal into those cavities, and when they pull it back apart, the areas where the edges met together are where your mold lines will be. It's essentially like tiny imperfections where the material they're casting in wicks out into those tiny little gaps. So you're left with, hopefully, some very minor lines around your models. All right, so what's next?
I think the next thing that's really crucial to learn is to dry fit your models first before you put any glue or anything down on them. You want to make sure they're going to fit together, and they're going to fit together well. You know, make sure that all the joints line up well. You don't have any gaps between them. And if you do, actually take and make some alterations to them sometimes and do that. But you got to do that really carefully because you may mess something up.
Cutting away pieces to make them fit together may end up leaving you with bigger gaps and chunks missing, which can be fixed either with super glue or with putty, but less work is better.
So the next thing I was completely unaware of, because mostly we deal in plastic models for some of the games that we're playing right now, but Austin actually informed me about a specific thing that needs to be done to pewter and resin models.
And that is washing them. You should wash your pewter and resin models, both because they have a layer or probably have a layer of something on the outside. And it's 2 different things for the 2 different materials. With resin, most of the time they're casting into silicone molds, which means that they're probably coating the insides of those molds with what's called a release agent. It makes it easier to peel the parts out of the mold without damaging the mold after everything's set up. Now, that stuff is essentially like a water-soluble sealing agent that just helps keep a barrier between the casting plastic and the silicone. But it'll wash right off. If you don't, though, it creates a barrier between your plastic and the glue, or the plastic and the paint that you're trying to apply to it, making it easier for parts to break off or for your paint to chip. With pewter, as I've been told, because I don't know this for a fact, I'm not a biologist or anything, but apparently there's some type of mold that likes to grow. It's you're not going to see like giant mushrooms or like fungus growing off of your models, but this thin layer of mold likes to grow on pewter, especially when it's sitting in nice, dark, cool places like warehouses. And that stuff is easily washed off by just using a little bit of warm water and soap. And that keeps essentially the same types of not fun things happening to that we're just talking about with the resin.
So another thing that's a little more cautionary when we say this, you could use something like heat for reshaping your models. Now, it's not always a good idea, but if you had a situation like I had where my fell hammers from Wrath of Kings, I painted them up a little bit and got everything assembled, and then they sat in my car for a little while. The hammers got a little bendy. They looked a little more like Nerf hammers than actual small hammers that could damage anything. And so it kind of threw off the aesthetic a little bit, and I wanted to make sure that we got those back. So with a little short application of a heat gun or a hair dryer, you can do some great things.
Yeah. With really thin plastics, you need to be very careful. Using a hair dryer on high would probably do it. Soaking it in hot water. You don't want to boil it or anything. And also just be careful if you're using really hot water. You can dip your models in, they become a little more pliable, and you can straighten out swords and spears and the shafts of hammers. Or all kinds of other things. If you're working with big resin models, perhaps from Forge World, I've had a lot of situations where you'll get thin plating that is the side plating and top plating for tanks, for converting the normal GW plastic tanks to the super cool looking Forge World variants. And those plates, because they're thin and very wide and long, tend to warp a little bit when they're shipped over from the UK.
If you learned nothing else from us today, make sure you use the right tools, become very familiar with your supplies, and take your time.
We want to thank you guys for watching this video. We hope you enjoyed it, maybe learned something. If you did enjoy it, hit the like button. It helps us a lot. Subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any videos in the future. Leave us a comment about things you'd like us to talk about in the next video or the one after that. Thanks again, and until next time, happy wargaming.